Well, thank you very much for the presentation. So we're gonna start the question and answer discussion period. And so feel free to raise your hand. Ari has his hand up. Ari, go ahead.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, John, for your story. Of course, it's a story that I'm familiar with because you've talked about it many times. I just want to say that, one of the things we pride ourselves in is to be transparent, but it also means that if you make mistakes, you make them publicly, and we certainly did. So the 2016 elections were not our finest hour. But of course, it has led us to several discussions with John, and we've shared background information and other details. And if you go to our website, you will see the current weighting is pretty much what John just told us that we should have done all along. So I think at the end of the day, it doesn't make me happy what we did, but I'm very happy with where we are now. So I think it was very helpful. There's one thing that John said that he said is a little more speculative, and I'm also less convinced that he is right, but also I have to admit I'm not entirely sure, and that's about the probability question format. So on the one hand, I agree that probability questions are difficult, right? And there is sort of an issue whether people can really allocate probabilities across choice. On the other hand, we have found several times that if you use the self-professed probabilities to predict what they then say they have done later, and of course I realize, it's twice self-report, you always find a coefficient of 1, which is exactly what you would expect if the probability were an unbiased predictor of people's behavior. So I think that probability format is still something that we probably want to do more work on to see whether or not that works. But for the rest, we have learned a hard lesson, but I think we learned something. So thanks.
Yes, thank you very much. I have another question for John here in the chat. And you had, among the secondary weighting considerations, you had a variable height greater than 70 inches. Does this height really have a meaningful effect on public opinion?
Yeah, so sorry that I had to go quickly in my 10-minute limit. Let me explain. That was not a variable that was used in weighting. That was one of many variables that were used to assess the accuracy of the survey. So in other words, the variables that were shown on the left of the slide, standard demographics, were used in post-stratification. The variables on the right-hand side of that slide were variables like smoking and height. And so we can simply ask the question, if you were interested in measuring smoking or you were interested in measuring height, would using the new weights improve the accuracy of those measurements? And the answer is yes, it would. And so lots of papers going back to 2000 have used variables like that to assess the accuracy, representativeness of samples. So we did that in this case. But of course, the greatest interest was in voter turnout and in candidate choice. And that was our greater focus. So I think you can think of it not as height being about public opinion, but rather if you are a health researcher and you want to compute something about obesity and you need to compute BMI with height and weight, then you would want that to be accurate.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. So I have another question in the chat, and this is a question for Jenny. Why do you think the non-probability sample were more likely to straight line their responses? Any conjectures?
We have a few theories, but they're just theories. So I would say one is probably in the way that non-probabilities or samples are recruited and motivated. A lot of it focuses around trying to earn monetary incentives and getting paid for completing surveys. So I think there's some motivation there to try to complete as many surveys as possible, as quickly as possible. They also tend to invite their respondents to more surveys than we do for our own panel. We try to limit our respondents to only completing a few surveys per month. Whereas with the non-probability, if you're being invited to multiple surveys per week, maybe you're just trying to get through them as quickly as you can. Another explanation we've thought of is it could be possible that for some of these questions, I'm thinking specifically about the discrimination section, respondents might have thought that they needed to answer a certain way to filter through the survey and actually be eligible to complete the rest of the survey. Many times in the non-probability surveys, you might get through 10 minutes of questions only to find out you didn't qualify. So we saw some examples of this in other questions where it looks like maybe people were trying, and again, this is just our hypothesis, but it looks like people were maybe trying to sort of game the system and figure out what's the right answer to keep moving forward and get myself closer to my reward. And we don't filter respondents out in that way in our panel. We're not sort of training people to game the system.
Great, thank you. And then there is a question, Ipek Bilgen, please.
Hi. My question is for Jenny too. So Jenny, in your presentation, you mentioned you folks provided $10 for African Americans and Hispanic versus $1 for others. Have you looked into any impact, long-term impact of these incentive spikes, and whether if it creates a specific in terms of panelists, if it creates any expectations in terms of incentives, and if there's any like picking and choosing because of these incentive spikes?
We haven't necessarily seen, I don't know that I've seen evidence of picking and choosing, but it's a very valid concern. We haven't set this up in a way where we have an experimental design and I have really conclusive empirical evidence. But when the Gallup panel first started, we offered no incentives whatsoever, really, to try to combat what I was just talking about, and not wanting people to be motivated just to get through the survey as quickly as possible and earn incentives. We've since then realized it's really important to offer incentives to try to represent people that are typically harder to reach. And the differential incentives have been really helpful for us in terms of trying to improve response rates from groups that can typically be a little bit challenging. As we've started to offer incentives and offer larger and larger incentives, it seems like people do have the expectation, like, I better get a nice little incentive for this. We had one where, we offered $1 for it and we had some people complaining, and we had someone who was like, you guys are cheap and I need more money than this. And so it does seem like we're maybe starting to reinforce some behaviors. Although I will say we have some internal studies where we just can't afford to pay people large incentives. We offer no incentives at all. And we still see really strong response rates with that study and pretty good participation across all groups.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested in seeing long-term impact of these type of interventions, not just incentive, but other interventions as well. Okay. Thank you.
Great. Any other questions? Let me maybe read. There is a comment in the chat, and I'll read that. Non-probability panels also pay trivial incentives. I've joined them to learn about the user experience. Most of the surveys are market research instead of public opinion, so less interesting. And I get a few cents for participating instead of a few dollars. No wonder people straight line. Yeah. Any other questions? Well, I have a question maybe for Randall. The addition of non-probability samples, is that something that is internally a push, or do paying clients pay for that, or like care for that?
Well, yes, to supplement for these smaller incident or lower incidence populations or groups, there are ways in which we do use opt-in sample to supplement, and Mansour Fahimi and Francis Barlas and I have been working on the calibration of opt-in to try to remove their inherent biases. But even in opt-in samples 20 years ago, we found that targeted samples within opt-in are also somewhat different than general population opt-in. So, the whole point is to be very careful and consider how people get targeted and how that might differentiate them from the non-targeted people you're also interested in. But yes, I mean, so targeting is one way in ABS to try to improve the saturation of the groups you're interested in. But as I showed, it is also associated with potentials for bias. And similarly in opt-in, we have to be careful as well.
Yes, thank you very much. I don't see any other questions right now. Going once, going twice. Then let me thank the speakers. The clapping is a little hard in this environment. I also hope we get back in person. And but I'm going to close out the session right now. Thank you very much, everybody.